maybe would ask all you kids 2 questions to be paying attention to during the message today. One, which maybe will take you have to be paying attention kind of all the way through to kind of get, but the first question would be, how long was Noah in the ark? Okay. And the second question, so how long was he in the ark? And the second question would be, what is the first thing Noah did when he got off of the ark? What was the first thing he did when he got off of the ark? So I want you to keep those things in mind, and we'll talk about them today. I said, give me just another minute or so. There's a couple that are still gone, so. Does anyone have any burning question about this chapter you've always wondered you want to put a plug in for before I would embark on our attempt to explain the chapter? Now's your chance to work it in instead of get it as an afterthought. So, fair enough. Jared, are we still planning next weekend to, not next weekend, but the weekend after, to be here and have that work day here? Okay. 27th. So if you know of anything that needs to be done, let Jared know. Whether we could do it that day or not, it's good to have that kind of a running list. He won't take it as nagging, I promise. Jared, is Leah? Okay, that's fine. All right. That was one other that I was waiting on and didn't want to. Okay. Well, why don't we just then pray at the outset and ask for God's help in understanding this text, which in one sense seems very straightforward and easy. But like everything else in the Bible, it's told to us for a reason, and we want to get what we should get out of it. So let's pray and ask the Lord for His help. Heavenly Father, we come now to this time of our meeting, and we're giving special attention to your words, and so that's important. And we ask for your help to make the words clear, make the meaning clear, and not just clear to our mind, but make it matter in our hearts. Cause us to think rightly, more rightly about you, to be affected by your character and your ways, the way that we ought to be, and to get out of this story all that we're supposed to, that it wouldn't just be this thing that happened long ago, something we're aware of, but something that we think about and that affects our day and our life. We ask these things in the name of Christ. We think even that He was one who He specifically reminded people about these events during His life, that they were forgetting some of the lessons that they should have remembered. So help us in that. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Well, I mentioned it in the prayer there, but it is certainly one of the reasons I take courage in spending some time, several weeks, talking about the flood, in that the Lord Himself had to remind people that they were forgetting. Peter also reminds us that many people, they willingly even forget about what God did in the flood. And Peter reminds us also in terms of even when we're going through hard times, hey, listen, God is able to deliver you from temptation, and God is able to rescue you from wicked men. and he's done it before, and remember the flood, and don't forget these lessons. And so there's all sorts of things that we are to remember and carry with us from these events and the story as it's told. The first thing I want to do today, we're not going to just read through the whole passage. That will happen kind of as we go, just for the sake of time. But one of the first things I want to do is to remind you something I had mentioned a few weeks back, and that is that this story of the flood is told in what's called a chiastic structure. So you have, it's kind of parallel. So you have God making this decision that he tells Noah what he's going to do. He's going to flood all the earth. It starts with that. God looks out and he says, because man is this way, I'm going to flood the earth. It ends with, even though man is this way, I'm not going to do this again. So kind of the same thing at the beginning, at the end, and then the next step, it's similar, and you go on and you end up with, the flood. Noah builds an ark. Noah builds an altar. You have the God commands Noah to go into the ark. God commands Noah to come out of the ark. The flood the flood waters begin, and it rains for 40 days and 40 nights. Later, you have it drying for 40 days. You have the flood prevailing for 150 days on the earth. And then on the other side of that, you have, it says, after the flood, the waters prevailed for 150 days, then this is what happened. Things began to dry out, and you have this period of drying out. Right there, sandwiched in the middle, though, you have this, what we start with in chapter 8. But God remembered Noah. God remembered Noah. And so this is kind of the turning point of the whole flood account. This is when, up till now, we've seen God is angry with men. He's wrathful, but he's also just kind of judicial. Men have done this, therefore God in his heart is moved to act in such a way that the sin, the violence, the ruin of his creation has reached such a level that he's moved to act. There's one righteous man, blameless man. He's walking with God. He's going to preserve him and some others with him. And God's not giving up on what he set out to do in creation, and he's going to preserve everything. But the world of men and all that men are over and experience is going to be totally and utterly destroyed. And what we have seen in all of chapter 7 basically is that is exactly what has happened. And all the mountains are covered, even to a height of 15 cubits above the mountains, and everything is wiped out under this watery chaos. And it looks a lot like things looked like in Genesis 1 before God did anything. And then God remembered Noah. And he began then to remove the waters and to dry the earth and to make the earth a place to inhabit again, and where man could live and animals could live, and to make it something that he had originally intended it to be to begin with. So this is what we see, this great turning point. And it all hinges on what we see on, but God remembered Noah. Now what I want to do today is basically to just work through the chapter, and that will be kind of the first section of the message, probably definitely the longest section. And then we will just highlight several things, and just a couple things, and talk about them, and hopefully glean a lot from that. So that's all we're going to do. So to begin with, we pick up in Genesis chapter 8, verse 1. But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. And I'm going to stop there. And that's the first, as I see it, the first section of this chapter, because it's the hinge, it's this pivotal point. God remembered. Think of this for a moment. Think of Noah's situation with the animals on the ark at this point. He was likely, not at this point, already on the ark for 150 days. I don't know about you, but if somebody says, I'm going to send a massive flood and it's going to destroy everything, and you're going to be in this boat and all the animals are going to be on it, and bring food because you guys are going to need to eat and store everything up, and now you're all on there, and okay, here comes the flood. And 150 days later, and there's no dry land in sight. What a thing. He's just being tossed around and tossed about on the ark. There's not another soul in the world but the 8 that are on board his ship. 150 days have passed at this point in, and things are bleak. You can't help but feel, if you're Noah, that however much you may have had a sense before that your every good fortune in life, and your every breath, and all the prospects you ever had for the future are all dependent upon God. However much you felt that way before, surely now you know and you feel very certain that if anything is ever going to happen for you in life, if you're ever going to get off this boat, it's going to depend on God. Surely you feel your dependence on God more deeply than ever. I mean, you're at His mercy. God came, put you and all these animals, said, build this boat because I'm going to kill everything that's not on the boat, and I'll take these animals and you guys get in there, and He shuts you in, and then He just destroys the whole world when you can't, even if you wanted to, you could not survive outside this boat. You're just waiting on God to say so. Life is on pause for you. What a thing. And so God remembered Noah. It was not that God remembered what He had forgotten, right? You might have this idea that, the flood got so bad and God said, now Noah, you guys can get in there and stay safe in that boat, and then just God in a fit of anger destroys everything, and then it's like, oh, Noah, shoot. I can't just keep this going, right? The waters have been going up and up and up and up and up and up and up, but I have to stop because I forgot about Noah. I better change my mind and change what we're doing. That's not what we're talking about. He doesn't come back to his senses. He doesn't, he was in a rage and now he's thinking clearly again. That's not the way it is. Just the opposite. When God remembers someone in the Bible in this way, it's that He chooses to act for them and to rescue them from destruction or to save them from barrenness, right? I mean, from a lack of fruitfulness or from being utterly destroyed. God remembers you savingly. He thinks upon you in such a way as He wants to act on your behalf. He remembers that He cares for you. He remembers that He wants to deliver you. He remembers things that He's promised you. He remembers and He acts. It's not that God had forgotten, but the time has come to act. And in our experience, it's as though God remembers. Think about Noah there in the ark. I mean, is God, how long, O Lord? Has He just forgotten us? It's 150 days. It keeps rising. What are we going to do? And then God remembers Noah, and things begin to change. I want to read just from two commentators who I think say this very well. I found as I was trying to write things, I just kept using their phrases. I thought, oh, that's silly. I'm just going to quote them. So I'll give you the names later if you like. But first of all, God remembered him and His covenant with him and the promise that He had made to him, and that he and his family and all the living creatures in the ark should be preserved alive during the flood. And God may be said particularly to remember him and them when He began to take measures for removing the waters from the earth, as He did by sending a wind, next mentioned. And thus God's helping His people when in difficulties, and thus God's helping His people when in difficulties and in distress, and delivering them out of their troubles, is called His remembrance of them. So what he's saying is, when it says God remembered, what we see, it's immediately associated with God acting to deliver them, which is basically what I'd said before. And He not only remembered Noah and his family, who are included in Him, but every living creature also, which is expressed, it's explicitly stated, in all the living creatures. For as the creatures suffered in the flood for the sins of men, so those in the ark were remembered and preserved for the sake of Noah and his family and the world of men that should spring from them. So what we have here is God's determination that for Noah's sake, the floods need to begin to recede. We got to change things now. He needs to change what's happening for Noah and for those that are with him. One other man said it this way: we have here an act of God's grace. God remembered Noah and every living thing. This is an expression after the manner of men. It's kind of a human way of talking, right? For not any of His creatures, much less any of His people, are forgotten of God. But the whole race of mankind, except for Noah and his family, was now extinguished and driven into the land of forgetfulness, to be remembered no more. So that God's remembering Noah was the return of His mercy to mankind, of whom he would not make a full end. It is a strange expression from Ezekiel chapter 5 for the 13. When I have accomplished my fury in them, I will be comforted. The demands of divine justice had been answered by the ruin of those sinners. He had eased him of his adversaries, God had, and now his spirit was quieted. And he remembered Noah and every living thing. He remembered mercy in all that wrath. He remembered the days of old, remembered the holy seed, and then remembered Noah. Noah himself, though one that had found grace in the eyes of the Lord, yet seemed to be forgotten in the ark, and perhaps began to think himself as forgotten. For we do not find that God had told him how long he should be confined. God never told him how long he was going to be on the ark, and when he would be released. After all, very good men have sometimes been ready to conclude that they themselves have been forgotten of God, especially when their afflictions or their troubles have been unusually grievous or unusually long. Perhaps Noah, though a great believer, yet when he found the flood continuing so long after it might reasonably be thought to have done its work, perhaps he was tempted to fear lest he that shut him in would keep him in, and began to expostulate, How long wilt thou forget me? But at length God returned in mercy to him. And this is expressed by remembering him. Note that those God remembers shall certainly be, that those that remember God shall certainly be remembered by God. Right? Noah was one who walked with God, and now God remembers him. How desolate and how disconsolate soever their condition might be, God will remember them. He will appoint them a set time and remember them. With Noah, God remembered every living thing, for though his delight is especially in the sons of men, though God especially delights in the sons of men, yet he rejoices in all his works and hates nothing that he has made. He takes special care not only of his people's persons, but of their possessions, of them and of all that belongs to them. Remember Nineveh? In Jonah, it actually says that God remembered I can't remember how many thousands of people lived in Nineveh, and it says, in as many cattle. It's like, what does that have to do with it? Well, God cares, and God cares here as well. Not only Noah and his sons and their wives, but also even these animals. What was God's remembrance of Noah? It was his relieving him. Note, those whom God remembers, he remembers effectually, for good. He remembers us to save us, that we may remember him to serve him. So that's what those men said on that. I thought it was very helpful. Now, the next section, the second half of verse 1 through the end of verse 5. So God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark, and then here we proceed. And God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. The foundations of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed. The rain from the heavens was restrained, and the waters receded from the earth continually. At the end of 150 days, the waters had abated. And in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. And the waters continued to abate until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the 1st day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen. All right. Now, this section I've kind of just titled, The Tide Turns, right? So if God remembered, now the tide turns. Maybe in a literal sense. So God's remembrance of Noah spurs him to send a wind over the earth and to begin the removal of water from over the face of the earth. We read about several things. First, we read about this wind that he makes to blow over the earth. Then we read also of the fountains. It says, the fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed. The rain from the heavens was restrained, and the waters receded from the earth continually. So this is what happened. So the fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed, and the rain from the heavens were restrained. And that this having been accomplished, then the water receded from the earth continually. A couple things just to say on this. You might think that it's kind of just given in chronological order. The first thing that happens is God begins to make this wind blow over the earth. And the fountains of the deep and the windows of heavens, then those are closed. And then the rain from the heaven was restrained, and then the waters started receding. But I don't think that can be the case, because we're told earlier in chapter 7 that the rain only fell for 40 days and 40 nights. And it's in verse 3 it tells us it's at the end of the 150 days that the waters had abated. So, in Genesis chapter 7, verse 24 says the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. So the flood begins, and for the first 40 days you've got all kinds of rain. But then you have another 110 days that the water keeps rising and rising and rising without rain. It rained 40 days and 40 nights. The rain quit, and the water kept rising and rising and rising and rising and rising. Well, you say, well, where did it come from? And not from the sky. We're told the fountains of all the fountains of the great deep burst forth. That's where this water had come from. So it keeps going up and up and up and up. And so, what I think is described here, the way we're to understand this, is that when God remembers Noah, we're to take into account the end. What he's saying is the flood ended. How did it end? Well, all these things were a factor. This is the kind of thing that happened. Okay, first of all, the fountains of God made this wind to blow over the earth, and the water subsided. That was part of it. God made a wind to blow over the earth, which means it probably wasn't that windy after those 40 days and 40 nights of rain. If now begins this wind. I don't mean to say the seas weren't rough, because it's rising like crazy, right? So, but just that there wasn't the wind. The fountains of the deep and the windows of heavens were closed. Before, what happened? God opened, they burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. Now, the fountains of the deep they're all closed. Well, who can open and close such things? God. This is miraculous. As much as we'll look at this, and this will describe to you, this whole chapter will sound to you like just normal evaporation and drying out of the land, God did this. So only God can take the world and flood it in this way, and open the heavens in this way, and open the foundations of the fountains of the deep in this way. And only God can seal these things up and cause this water to go away. It's a miracle. The whole thing's a miracle. Remember that. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed, and the rain from the heavens was restrained, and the waters receded from the earth continually. Now we can look at this and we can say, well, if there's wind blowing, and there's whatever the fountains of the deep aren't bursting forth anymore with water, and if it's not raining, right? I may have mentioned that already, but if those things are happening, then the earth would dry out. And yes, of course, naturally they would. But God had unleashed a source of waters upon the earth that is not normal. And those waters had to be put away in a way that was not normal. And God had to do it. And that's what God did. And then He used means from then on. Something that you don't see here, just kind of assumed, I think, for us. It says the wind caused all this to dry up, but you don't hear anything about the sun coming out and drying things out, which is what, don't we always think about that? The rain comes and everything comes. You don't think, oh, I wish the wind would just come whipping through here and dry this out. Instead, you think, I wish the sun would come out and dry it all out. And it doesn't say the sun dried it all out. And that's kind of odd. It's fine. Moses is free to write it this way, but it's kind of an odd thing. Well, it's not so odd when, again, you compare it with the other tales of the flood, where the men get out of the ark, and after the flood's over, and immediately prostrate themselves to the so-called sun god and thank him for drying out the earth and putting an end to the flood that the other gods had caused. Sun didn't even play a role in this. It's kind of assumed, right? We know this. We know the way things work, but it's not mentioned. Just passed over. Because, again, God is the one who's sovereign here. It's not competing gods, and it's not something like that. One God. And it wasn't that He wanted to destroy everything, and another God kind of foiled His plans and snuck one in on Him but rather God remembered Noah, and God began to dry things out of his own will and of his own ability. Now, again, in the biblical account, the role of the Son is not even mentioned. It is not an actor in the account. It's certainly not a God to be worshipped or thanked. God is in absolute control of the whole event. It says in verse 3, at the end of 150 days, the waters had abated. Don't take that to mean that earlier you had 150 days where the water was rising, rising, rising. Now you have 150 days where it's going down. It's not that way. And actually, if you look at the dates of things, what month it is and what day it is, you realize it can't possibly mean that. What it means is the flood began, and for 150 days the waters increased and increased and increased. And then after the end of 150 days, the waters had abated. They stopped increasing. They ceased, and now they begin to dry up. Now, at that 150 days, what happens? And in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. And the waters continued to abate until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen. So in verse 4, you have the 7th month, the 17th day of the month. That's exactly 5 months or 150 days from when the flood began, based on what the date given to us in Genesis 7. That's what I'm saying. It's 150 days. So at the end of 150 days, he's been floating around and everything. The ark comes to stop on some mountain. We hit something. I don't know how many times they had hit other things before, but finally they've hit something, and they're not getting tossed around anymore. They're just kind of still. They're stuck somewhere, and they know it. That's day 150. And the waters continued to abate until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, that's 2.5 months later, so you get hung up somewhere, 2.5 months later, you can look out, if you can climb up and look out the windows or the gap there in the ark, and you can see, you can finally start to see these mountaintops. Which means probably some mountains, it's not, I mean, all mountains aren't the same height, right? And wherever Noah is, he can't see all mountains in the world. But wherever he's at, he can look out and he can see the mountains. Does that mean only the very tallest mountains, or does it mean, people in Colorado, they come to Missouri and they say the Ozark Mountains, really? Those aren't mountains. I can't tell you how many people I've heard come through and be like, yeah, we went to these Ozark Mountains you guys say you had. We're like hills. It's like, well, they don't understand when we put roads in, we basically took the tops of the mountains and flipped them over and made our roads. That's kind of what we did for a lot of it. But anyway, it's just kind of funny that there's that difference in perspective. So what's Noah? He looks out, and what does he see? Well, he sees probably lots of the really tall mountains, and then some of the shorter mountains, you just kind of see the peaks, and you just kind of see all the high spots. You don't really see anything else. And that's what 2.5 months later, that's what he sees. So the tide turns. Things are drying out. Now then, verse 6. So that was at the 10th month, first day of that month. Now then, verses 6 through 12, the next section, the earth becomes a place to be inhabited again. Not just we're no longer flooding and things are drying out, but the earth at the end of this stage has become inhabitable again. Verse 6, at the end of 40 days, Noah opened the window of the ark that he had made and sent forth a raven. Sent forth a raven. Sent a bird out. A raven. What do ravens eat? Can anyone tell me what ravens eat? Go ahead. Worms? Well, probably not. That's a good guess. A lot of birds eat worms. Yes? Raisins? I don't think so. Chris? No. A lot of birds, they can eat some of those things, but what is a raven kind of known for eating? Nobody knows. That's not good. They eat dead animals. They're a bird of prey. They're a scavenger bird, right? So it's like we see vultures and things like that. They find a dead animal, and guys ever drive down the road and see some dead animal and there's a bunch of birds eating on it? A raven is a bird like that. I'm not saying you've seen ravens doing that necessarily, but that's what a raven does. And the first thing he sends out is a raven. So here's this raven, and he goes out. And what does he do? It went to and fro until the waters were dried up from the earth. That thing feasted. That's what it did. You sent the raven out. The raven didn't come back. There was plenty for that raven to eat. So what was out there? A lot of dead animals and people and stuff. It's pretty gross. And that's what the raven's eating. And Noah let him out first, and he just went out there and stayed out there. Never came back. He didn't need to come back. The tops of the mountains were dry enough, and he could eat. And so he stayed until, what does it say? It went to and fro until the waters were dried up from the earth. So it just went on its own way. It was released and never came back to the ark. It just did its own thing. We don't see the raven again. Now, so that's a period of time. That was in the 10th month. In the first day of that 10th month, you have 40 days after that, he lets the raven go. And we read about later when he got off the ark, when things were dry and he got off the ark. So there's a period of months, or more than a month, when this raven is just going out and this is the way it lives. So that's kind of gross, right? I mean, that's not the picture we want to think about. When we think of post-flood world, we don't think of carcasses. Like we think clean, nice, no more trace of bad stuff anymore. It's all just new. But that's not what the picture the Bible presents. The first thing it presents for us, the first thing that went out there in this kind of newly reformed world is a raven, and it never needed to come back. It didn't lack food. It went out for a period of months and never came back, the scavenger bird. So that's the earth, as you might think of it, at this point. It's kind of a frightful place. It went to and fro until the waters were dried up from the earth. Verse 8, then he sent forth a dove from him to see if the waters had subsided from the face of the ground. So just because the raven doesn't come back doesn't mean it's a place you want to go live, right? I mean, the raven, that's something different. Are we going to be able to live out there? So he sends a dove out. Now a dove, you can get a dove to eat other things than just seed, but pretty much a dove just eats seed. Like on its own, that's all it's eating. It might, very rarely, I looked it up because I just wanted to be sure. I didn't want to say that and not be right. They say like very rarely a dove might eat like a snail, but almost exclusively all it eats is seed. And you can have a dove in captivity or something, or a dove at a park that's always around people that you can get to eat some other things, but the dove won't eat other things naturally. So he sends out a dove. But the dove found no place to set her foot, and she returned to him in the ark. Now, is that literally true? Is there nowhere for the dove to set its foot? Well, no, you can see the mountaintops. It can land. It can rest. It can go wherever it wants to go. Now, there's a lot of water still. A lot of things are still covered in water, perhaps. It's super soggy out. Maybe there's places it doesn't want to land because it gets stuck. But when it says it has no place to set its foot, it means there's no home for it here. There's nowhere for it to live and make a life. There's nothing for it. Nothing to eat. It's got to come back. It goes out, flies around and around and around and around and around and around and doesn't find, if it finds food, it doesn't find enough food, and it's got to come back. There was no place for it there. The earth is still not a habitable place. The only thing that can live there is scavenger birds. That is not where we want to live. But that's it for now. But the dove found no place to set her foot, and she returned to him to the ark, for the waters were still on the face of the whole earth. So he put out his hand and took her and brought her into the ark with him. It's a curious phrase. I'll just mention, I don't know what to make of it, but it's just curious, and maybe it gets your wheels to turn, and maybe you have an idea about it. But the last time we read about anyone extending out their hand was when God said, banished man, and said, lest he stretch forth his hand and take of this tree of life. And he didn't want that. Well, now Noah stretches out his hand out of the ark and provides harbor for this dove, receives the dove. Well, anyway, so he brought her into the ark with him. He waited another 7 days. So we've got 40 plus 7. So he waited another 7 days, and again he sent forth the dove out of the ark. And the dove came back to him in the evening, so it was out all day. And behold, in her mouth was a freshly plucked olive leaf. Things are growing. She was eating, and she brought back this leaf in her mouth. What a thing. So, what is noted? He knew that the waters had subsided from the earth. So he burst forth out of there. Nope. What does it say? So then he waited another 7 days and sent forth the dove. And she did not return to him anymore. So now the dove not just has something that she can eat or get something, but now she's got a home. The dove has a home. And so it's able to be inhabited even by a dove. So what do we read? So now we'll go that's the next section. The flood, or the earth, becomes a place to be inhabited again. Now, next section. Noah leads the exit of the ark by God's command. Verses 13 through 19. In the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month. So what day is that? I'll say it again. Listen, what day is it? If I say it's the first month of the year, and it's the first day of that month, what do we call that day?
January 1st.
January 1st, or what? New Year's Day. Happy New Year, Noah, right? The 601st year of his life, on New Year's Day, he gets to leave. He gets to leave. That's a good day for New Year's resolutions right there. And he makes one. We'll read here in a minute, of sorts. Now, the first day of the month, the waters were dried from off the earth. And Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry. Right? So he sees it's all dry. So I don't know why I said that he leaves there. He doesn't leave, but he sees that it's dry. It's all dry. Now, so what happens is, the word here that's used, and it says he removed the covering of the ark. The covering, it's a different word that was used before. Remember before there was a question about this window closing or a roof and kind of what it was, that opening that he made. This is something different. And it's not the door that he put in on the side. It's not that either. It's not that word. It's other guys talk about it's like a hatch or something. Like he's got some kind of a, I don't know what it is, but he opens that thing up and he sees. Removed the covering of the ark and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry. There was some way that he could remove something to open and get a better view that he hadn't done until now. And he does it. And so the ground was dry. New Year's Day, the ground was dry. Now in the second month, so the next month, on the 27th day of the month, so almost 2 whole months later, he looks at it and says it's all dry, and he sits there, and you and I would say, look, the birds, they got a place to be. He looks out, it's all dry, let's go. But he doesn't. He waits 2 more months waiting. It says on the 27th day of the month, the earth had dried out. Then God said to Noah, go out from the ark, you and your wife and your sons wives with you. So then God makes the command. So what happens is Noah opens this hatch or whatever it is, this door or whatever, something, and he sees, and things are pretty well dry. They're not, and you can see everything. You see all the ground, you see there's a stream over there, and things look good. Grass is growing or whatever. Plants are doing good. The birds that are out there, or I don't know if you see them or not, but they're there. Things look pretty good. It's not all the way quite dry yet. The word that's used in the next verse, in the second month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth had dried out. That's a different word, and it actually means it's more dry. And so things were dry enough, but almost 2 whole months later, now it's really dry. Now it's time to go. But he still doesn't go on his own accord. Then God said to Noah, this is the first time God spoke to Noah since he told him to get on the ark. Now that's amazing. The second month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth had dried out. Then God said to Noah, go out from the ark, you and your wife and your sons wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing that is with you of all flesh, birds and animals and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, that they may swarm on the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth. Stop there. I told the kids to pay attention to how long Noah was on the ark, and now's your chance to learn, okay? If you look at chapter 7, verse 11, the 600th year of Noah's life, the second month, the 17th day of the month. So for us, if their months were counted like ours was, that would be February 17th, right? Second month, 17th day of the month. Now, verse 13 of chapter 8 says it's the 601st year, so it's the very next year. Now it's year 601 of his life, the next year. And verse 14, the second month, also February, on the 27th day of the month, February 27th. So February, and their New Year's Day isn't the same as ours, but just for the sake of you guys kids understanding it, February 17th, the flood began. He got on the ark and the flood began. The next year, February 27th, he got off the ark. So how long was he on the ark? A year? Almost a year? Not quite. That's close. What? 600 days? No, not even close. How many days are in a year? 365 days in our calendar year. Okay, so he's looking at 1 year. February 17th, 1 year, to February 17th the next year is 1 year. Right? Was he off on February 17th that next year? No, it was 10 days later. So 1 year and 10 days he was on the ark. That's a long time. 1 year and 10 days. Okay? So any way you slice it, it's a year and 10 days. Now different cultures have different lengths to their years. Like we have a leap year, right? We have 365 days, and every 4 years we got to add a day. And some of these places they do where they have shorter months, and then at the end of every so many years they have to add a month. So they keep track differently. But I want you to understand, we're looking at 1 year and 10 days. That's how long he was on the ark. How long was he on the ark?
1 year and 10 days.
All right. That's a little bit of trivia, but you're paying attention. Now, okay, so we see that. Then we see also what God says to him. He says, go out from the ark, you and your wife. Notice it's always this way. It's you and your wife, and then it's your sons and their wives with you. And then bring out with you every living thing that is with you of all flesh, birds and animals and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, that they may swarm on the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth. Why was Noah to bring all these animals out? That they may flourish, that they may be fruitful and multiply as well. We've got a responsibility of some sort towards the animals, right? Noah, bring them, put them on the boat, keep them alive, get food for them, preserve them, and you get off the boat, take them off so that they can thrive, so that they can flourish and multiply and swarm on the earth. That's what I want. So, verse 18, Noah went out, and his sons, and his wife, and his sons' wives with him. Every beast, every creeping thing, and every bird, everything that moves on the earth went out by families from the ark. If it lives on the land and it moves, it came off the ark. Is that what that text says? If it lives on the land and it moves, it came right off the ark. That day, it came off the ark. What a thing. So he leaves. Why? Notice he waits, though. I made a point of this. He waits until God's command. And I can't help but think that, just as the Lord had shut him in, just in reverence for God being God and man being man, Noah stays on the ark until God says, come off. Things looked pretty good. I mean, wouldn't you kind of be eager to get off the boat? I mean, aren't you a little bit tired of this by now? Aren't you ready to start a new life, to get a head start? We got a lot of work to do. We have nothing. But he waits. Things are dried. He waits another couple months until they're really dry, until God tells him, go, now's the time. He does it by God's command. Now, verses 20 through 22. I've just kind of titled this section, Noah's first act in this renewed earth and God's response. So Noah's first act in this new earth and God's response. So what has happened? So God tells him to go out Then Noah built an altar to the Lord. It doesn't say, then Noah found some trees, cut them down, built himself a house. What does he do? He builds an altar. He walks right off the ark and builds an altar to the Lord. And he took some of every clean animal. So those ones that had that 7 pair, he took some of every one of them, and some of every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. This wasn't one cow. We got 7 cows, or 14 cows, we're going to offer some of them. Was it 1? Was it 12 of the 14? I don't know how many he offered. Some of them, some of all of them. Whatever ones in his mind he considered clean that would be acceptable to him and acceptable to God, he took all of those and he took some of them and put them on this altar. And every kind of bird that he brought, remember there were 7 pairs of every kind of bird, he took some of every one of those birds and he offered them to God as a burnt offering to the Lord. And that sounds strange to us because we don't regularly make sacrifices to God, because we, as Christians, trust that God has made a sacrifice for us, for our sins. But here's Noah offering to God. Now, the offering that he gives, it's this whole offering, the whole animals. In Scripture, this is, there are different sacrifices. This sacrifice, you use this part of the animal, and that means this, and this other sacrifice, you use that same animal, but this other part, and that means this, right? First of all, understand it's a free will offering. God didn't command him to offer anything. He does this of his own will. He offers this to God. Remember earlier in Genesis where we had some men come and make some offerings to God, make tribute? It's not the same word, but I think there's an element of that too. Noah comes and he offers to the Lord. He acknowledges God. The first thing he does on this earth as it is, he acknowledges God. He makes some sort of a tribute. He makes an offering, this whole offering, everything's included. There's an answer for everything in his heart. There's an expression of it in these offerings. He's thankful to God. He's joyful to be alive and to have a new start. Sin's all the more serious in his mind. Here was a man who was walking with God, but he just saw an expression of God's wrath that man has never seen before and will never see again until the final day. He offered to God. I mean, the Bible may tell us that Noah was a righteous man, but you can't tell me Noah doesn't step off the ark and feel like God would have been totally just to have wiped me out too. He found favor. He found grace in the eyes of God. But it was, in a sense, because he was looking to God, because he was a righteous man and a blameless man in his generation, but not because he was righteous before God. He acknowledges his just deserts. It says then, the Lord's response is, the Lord was pleased. We know the Lord was pleased because it says, and when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, it was pleasing to him. When the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma. Now let me contrast this picture we're about to get from the Lord to what you have in these false narratives of the flood as well from other religions. There, in those, the gods, plural, right? There's the heroes kill some of these animals to feed the gods because the gods have been so angry, and so they're like, oh man, we've got to straighten out and do what we're supposed to do. So they go to feed all the gods, and the gods smell the aroma. They're intoxicated by it, and they swarm around the dead animals and the carcasses. It says like flies. That's what their texts say, like flies. That's not me making a pejorative statement and kind of saying, oh, they're just like flies. That's how bad they are. That's the way their own texts describe them. The gods behaved like flies on dead carcasses. That's the way they came upon this. They were so famished and hungry because they didn't realize what they were letting loose when they started the flood. How different that is from here, this picture. The Lord smelled the pleasing aroma. The Lord said in his heart. So when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, what did he do? He got down there as fast as he could because he was hungry. No, it says, he doesn't need this. It says, the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma. Then the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man. Though the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth, neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. So he decided not to curse the earth again and to destroy all flesh on account of man, even though man is as bad as he is. That was God's decision. He did that when he smelled this aroma, or when it's not just like we're not talking about the smell itself, but the idea of when God observes what Noah is doing, making this offering, sacrificing to the Lord in this way, expressing his heart to God in this way, God says this to himself. Notice that also. When the Lord smelled this pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart. This is God deliberating with himself. This is what God says in his own heart. He hasn't said anything to Noah yet. That's going to come later. He's going to make a covenant with Noah that expresses this, what his heart feels. But here it's just what God is saying in his own heart. I'll not do this again. Even though man is this way, I'll not do it again. Now, just a couple things I want to do here. Two things, two headings, and we'll conclude. The first thing is I want to compare and contrast, just briefly, the Genesis 1 creation account with this, what I call a renewal account. I just want to point out a couple things real quick. First of all, the Genesis 1 account is miraculous all the way through, right? God speaks, and it happens. Every time. It's just, sometimes it's described as, He creates, sometimes he forms, sometimes he says for this thing to happen and then the earth brings it forth. But every time it's all miraculous. We don't see these things happening all the time. It's completely miraculous from beginning to end. Well, this renewal account, you have a miraculous flood, you have it miraculously stopped, but then it's kind of what we would call natural causes, right? I mean, the wind's blowing, it's not raining, just drying out. That's very different. You have some of the same words used even. For instance, in Genesis chapter 8 and verse 1, God made a wind blow over the earth. The wind made a ruah. It's the same word for spirit, right? In Genesis chapter 1, right, it was the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. The picture is so similar. Here you have, in Genesis 1, the Spirit of God comes and begins to hover over, or to brood over was the word, over the face of the waters. Some kind of, before he speaks, he's doing some kind of activity, some preparatory action upon his creation. But here, in Genesis 8, the same word is used, ruah, but it's not the Spirit of God doing the same thing. Rather, it's just a wind that God sent to blow and to dry things out. God is, in Genesis 1, God is dividing the waters apart. The waters above and the waters below, and creating the dry, and causing the dry land to appear. In Genesis 8, He's causing the dry land to appear, but in a very different sense. He doesn't speak and command these things to separate, and He doesn't create a heavens. Rather, He closed off the windows of those heavens. They stayed there, and just things begin to dry out. The waters of the deep go back to their place where He'd already assigned them to be. From Genesis 1. They just kind of return. You don't have the speaking, God doesn't speak for the plants to form. Rather, what happens? The waters subside, the earth begins to dry out, the roots of these trees and these plants can begin to breathe again, and they begin to grow and to blossom. That's very different from a Genesis 1. So there's so many, and on one hand, there's so many similarities, and on the other, that's so different. What do you have in Genesis 8? What do you have on the earth first? You have all the plants. Same thing you had in Genesis 1. Then comes the animals, just like in Genesis 1. How are the animals described? Well, they're to be swarming, and they're to be fruitful and multiply, just like in Genesis 1. There's so many correlations, and yet it's a very different thing. It's not a recreation in this, on the same level that things were created the first way. Even though so much of it's a new start, a fresh start. That's why I call it a renewal. It's not a new creation, but it's a renewal. I just want you to see that. Now then, what I think is maybe more relevant to all of us is just to talk about the meaning, a little bit of Noah's sacrifice, and then the greater meaning, I think, of God's response. and maybe greater meanings of God's response. In terms of Noah and his sacrifice, I said it this way. First of all, it was a free will offering. Noah was blameless in his generation, and he walked with God, but in exiting the ark, it is the need for an offering that is first on his mind. The first thing on his mind. Now, I don't know what would, it's hard for us to put ourselves in Noah's shoes, right? I mean, or sandals or whatever. But it's, what would be the first thing to come to your mind when you get off the ark? Would it be to acknowledge God and bow to God? Give Him His place? He presents an offering of thankfulness, an offering of tribute, an offering for sin. It's a full-orbed acknowledgement of God's position as God and man's position as man. And this is pleasing to God. This is pleasing to God. It was costly. I mean, every animal, according to modern definitions, every animal on the face of the earth at this time, every animal in the ark was an extremely endangered species. And Noah goes out and first thing he does is he kills a bunch of them as an offering to God. It seems not rather counterproductive, except if you realize that all of this, if any of this is going to be fruitful and multiply and prosper, it's going to be because of God's blessing. So let's acknowledge God right now. The first thing we do if we're going to go out, we need His blessing. Again, if you were ever maybe a little unsure of that, surely the fact of the flood will remind you that nothing good happens in your life apart from the kindness of God extended to you. And so the very first thing Noah does is he sets out to say, and he acknowledges God, God, this is your place. We're here to serve you, to honor you, to live for you. Thank you for sparing us. These all belong to you, and we offer them to you. Now, it would have been disobedience for Noah to have taken all of any one of these clean animals or all of any one of these birds and sacrifice them all to God. Because God says, I want them to live. That's my intention, and to thrive. So if Noah goes and just kills them all, that's a problem. He's being disobedient. It's counterproductive. It's a sin against God. But he takes some. I'm tempted to think he takes all that he thought he could spare. I mean, because if you're in the mindset of we need all we've got, you're not going to sacrifice any of these things. You might maybe pile up a bunch of stones and say, remember the time we got off the ark. But if you're saying we're going to just offer these things to God and acknowledge Him in whatever the most radical way we can think of, that's what he does. He takes some of everything that has enough to spare and offers them to the Lord. Now, what is God's response then? Just to think about this. Again, as I said, it was something of an internal response, as it were, something God says in His own heart. We're told it's a pleasing aroma to God. And we could ask, why is that? And I think, again, it's because man embarks out into the world with an acknowledgement of God. The flood, if you think about the flood in this way, it is a bold message to humanity about the seriousness of sin and of God's willingness to act in judgment upon those who commit sin. If you're a sinner, the flood should be a loud warning to you. If you're without Christ, if you've not found atonement for your sins, this is kind of a small taste of what awaits you. And it's as though the flood had its intended goal. God didn't need the flood to deal with the sin of man, but He used the flood to deal with the sin of man. And He used it as a tool for those who would live after, as a reminder, a sign, if you were, a neon sign that you would see it and remember it and know, have learned something about the character of God and know that God means business about sin and that living for God is serious and that all the expectations that God gave to man at the beginning are real and lasting and ought to be kept. And Noah steps off the ark and acknowledges that exact thing. And it's pleasing to God. It's like Noah learned what he was supposed to learn here. He got the message. This isn't the kind of thing that's appropriate only when stepping off the ark, right? God wants this acknowledgement in our hearts all the time, day by day. That what we have comes from His hand, that He's to be acknowledged and thanked for and served with all that we have. And that it all rightly belongs to Him. That not only the lives of the animals, but our own life should be lived as a tribute to God. But we also see God's response here. This is amazing. He says in His heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man. Let's consider that. Curse the ground because of man. That happened in Genesis chapter 3. The ground was cursed because of man. And then here God describes the flood. I'd mentioned before, God describes the flood as a curse upon the ground. A fresh curse, a new curse. And God says, I'm never going to do that again. Now listen, I know later, as believers, we often say God will never flood the world again in this way. And He says that explicitly later in the next chapter. But here what He says is, I will never again curse the ground because of man. There will never come upon this earth anything that does anything like this again. That's what God said in His own heart. I will never curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done. I won't do this again. It's as though God took a step here in the flood, which He knew was necessary, which He didn't want to take necessarily. It was painful, it was hard, it was necessary. One time. He's not going to do it again. He'll never do this again. But notice also, He says He won't do this because of man. For, or even though, the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. So here's what God, on the front end we see, because man was so sinful before the flood, God decided to flood the world and to ruin man off the world, to ruin the world, because man had ruined the world. He was going to ruin man with the world. Start afresh. And now on the other side, God says, even though man is unchanged and will always be this way, I'm not going to do it again. And I might ask this, I think this is suggestive for us. I hope it is. If you read this within the context of the story arc of Genesis and what's beginning, the trajectory we're on now, we've been told that a man was going to come and set all these things right. We thought perhaps Noah might be the one, right? He was named. Maybe this one will give us the rest from all of our toil and labor and fix things. And flood happens, and he comes off and he offers to God, and then God says, well, even though mankind is just sinful, I'm not going to destroy it again in this way. I'm not going to curse the ground again in a fresh way because of this. You think, that's it? You think, okay, God, if man is this sinful, and you're not going to take care of the problem by cursing the earth anymore, then how are you going to take care of the problem? It ought to cause us to ask the question, well, how then will God solve the problem of the sinfulness of man and the ruin that men will continue to make of His earth? I mean, if the problem was that men, because of what was in their heart, was only evil continually, if they ruined the world, and now that the world is kind of given a fresh start, men goes out on it, but men are still the same and their heart is still only evil continually, then they're just going to ruin it all again. Well, what's God going to do this time? So we're not surprised, are we, as believers, when we look out upon the world and we see man making a ruin of this world as it is? I mean, they're just destroying things constantly. It's not surprising at all because of what's in the heart of men. But God says He won't do this. But He also makes a promise of sorts, or He vows, and you might say almost to Himself, while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. These things will continue forever. Despite what some may say, right? Things will get cold, things will get hot, things will get cold, things will get hot. God promised. Seed time and harvest will never cease. Summer and winter will never cease. Day and night will never cease, so long as this earth remains. So long as the earth remains. So there is a promise of some regularity here. Right? God says be fruitful and multiply. He wants that to happen. He wants things to flourish. Well, He's going to have to provide some regularity here. What did He do in Genesis 1 after He made the plants? Then He made some of these. Let's look here. Well, He made the dry land, made the plants. Then He makes the lights, and He makes the lights to serve then as time for seasons and for regulating the times and this kind of thing, for science and for seasons. And God does that here. Here's another part of His creation that He says this is going to continue. This will be sustained. This won't change. This will be permanent. You can count on these things. And there'll always be seeds and harvest, which doesn't mean you'll never have a bad crop. Doesn't mean there'll never be a drought or a famine. God sends those things at times. But upon the earth as a whole, this will never happen. These things will continue. You can count on it. God's will is not that humanity would cease. He's not left us here to kind of fend for ourselves. We live just like Cain did with those who went with him out to go make their own city. We may not acknowledge God, but we live under His blessing and His care and His providence to uphold us and to provide us with all things. As Paul could say, some of your own poets have said, in Him we live and move and have our being. And that's true. That hasn't changed. God promises regularity, dependability. As Noah sets out in the world with his sons, he can count on God, in a sense, to do his part, right? If God says, go out and be fruitful and multiply, I want you to take care, I want these animals to prosper, these are all the things I want to happen, God's going to enable him to do it. And He does it in these ways. Well, next time we'll begin to consider this covenant that God makes with Noah and this matter of capital punishment that comes in and eating of animals and all this stuff that comes up as we finish out this flood account. And then there will be maybe one or two messages in addition to that where we just look at some other things about the flood. Are there questions or comments about anything we've covered today? Maybe I'll ask the kids again, how long was Noah on the ark? Selena? 1 year and 10 days. Okay. All right. And what's the first thing Noah did when he got off the ark? Silas? An altar. Yeah. And what did he do on that altar? What did he do with that altar? Do you know? What did he do with it? He what? Kind of. So God doesn't need to eat, right? He doesn't have a body like we have. But he offered to God all those animals that maybe were really tasty to Noah or were the best animals, the ones he most liked, right? He offered to God those animals as an expression that they belonged to God and not to Noah. Okay? And that anything that, if anything good was going to happen to Noah, if they were going to make it, it was going to be because God provided for them. Okay? All right.